Hi, this is Jon Haas with Haas Off the Grid, your destination travel, adventure, fly fishing, and general fishing challenge show. I'm here to answer a couple questions, and the question I've got right now is, how do you fish with flies? Well, that's called fly fishing. And fly fishing is really about delivery. You know, all fishing is about delivery and presentation, and so fly fishing is no different. Instead of casting a lure or a weight or a lure with weight in it, or a bait with a weight on, weight to cast it out, you're actually casting the line. All the weight for the presentation is in the line. So when people say I have 5-weight line, 6-weight line, 10-weight line, they're talking about a certain weight that line weighs for a certain amount of distance, and I think it's like 28 feet is generally what a full fishing line weighs, and that's a certain amount of grams per that length of line will determine the weight, 5-weight, 6-weight, 10-weight of the line. Now, that's important because you're matching that up with the presentation of the fly. So in this case, I've got a dry fly. This is a salmon fly, pretty common fly, and we fish in the Northwest, like on the Deschutes. And we would match that up, the size of the fly, to the size of the weight of the line, so the presentation can be a delicate presentation. This happens to be a floating line because the fly that we're going to throw is a floating fly. So it's got a foam body, and it's got deer hair, which is hollow, so it floats. So when you put this out in the water, it's going to naturally float. You're going to add floating to it too to increase that floating ability. As the day goes on, the materials start to get soaked. But you're matching this all up to deliver a presentation based upon what the fish are requiring. And generally, you're trying to get into the food chain. So if the fish are keying on these salmon flies, they're probably at certain times when the flies are hatching, feeding off the surface, and other times they're feeding down below the surface, in which case you might use a sinking line, or you might use a floating line with what we call a dropper setup, where you'd have a strike indicator and you'd have a weight or weighted flies to allow the flies to be towards the bottom. So depending on the situation, again, it's delivery and presentation, you will choose whether it's a floating line or a sinking line. So that's the basics of it. This is a floating line. Let me just show you a sinking line. This is a sinking line. It's going to be heavier. When you throw it in the water, it's going to sink, and they're rated at different rates depending on the density of the material it's made of. You can see this one is a full sinking line. It's the whole length of line is going to sink, and you're going to want to generally use that for lake fishing, something where you have to get a pretty deep presentation, versus something like this, which has just a sink tip. So we have maybe 10 to 12 feet of sinking line, and the yellow is all floating line. So again, presentation is key, and delivery of that presentation is going to determine what you're going to use. So in this case, we're using a much heavier fly. I use this as a salmon setup. When we fish for big Chinooks, it's a heavier weight line. This is a 10-weight line, so I'll fish it for coho salmon and Chinook salmon that can go generally around 10 pounds, but they'll get up to 20 or 30 pounds at certain times of the year. And we'll use this because we're fishing in a river with fast water, so we want to control it. So we have a floating line that keeps the line towards the top, so we can mend that line and control that line. And we have a sinking tip so that the fly, generally a weighted fly, can sink pretty quickly and down to where the fish are, and you can guide that fly through its presentation to the fish. That's how you fish with flies 101 really quickly. Now let me just show you the variety of flies you can have depending on your situation. I showed you that salmon fly, but this is a whole box of dry flies. But generally you're going to fish all these on the top. You can also use one of the bigger flies as an indicator, and then have a dropper with a nymph. So these are the adult stages when they're coming up and hatching on the water. This is a nymph box that I have, and these are all kind of like the adolescent stage of those animals, the flies, right? You're generally going to try and throw twice as much line as the depth that you want that fly to be, and that's going to depend upon the speed of the current and things like that, and if you're throwing a weighted fly or not. But you have a lot of options, and fly fishing and fishing with flies is all about trying to unwrap that puzzle, right? It's about presentation and it's about delivery. So depending on where you have to deliver that fly, and depending upon how you have to present that fly, you're going to choose one of these different fly rod setups in your arsenal, right? Because fly fishing, like all kinds of fishing, is about the options and making sure you're utilizing all the different characteristics of the materials and the methods that you're using to optimize your chance of hooking a fish. If you take that approach and think of it as a puzzle and try and put all those pieces together and use the characteristics of the material and look at what the fish are doing and try and match the natural order of what's going on in the food chain that the fish is living in, you're going to be a much more successful fisherman and you're going to be on a lot more fish.